This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 3.2, Part B, on the disintegration of the 1850s. And when last we left, things were heating up quite a bit, and we had left it on something of a cliffhanger in 3.2. Part 1, with the Kansas Civil War, referred to as Bleeding Kansas. And the question, of course, was who won. And ultimately, who wins is the pro-slavery forces. And that can be seen here in the Lecompton Constitution. They get together, they form a constitution in Lecompton, Kansas, that supports slavery. Governor Walker, which is different than William Walker, who we mentioned in the last one, overturns the Constitution due to what he considered to be voting irregularities. And objectively speaking, they were voting irregularities. There were more votes cast than there were, in fact, registered voters in the state, which is, at the very least, suspicious. However, this is now 57, and President Buchanan intervenes to restore the Constitution. And he intervenes to restore the Constitution because a governor of a state does not have the constitutional authority to overturn a state's constitution. Like it or not, voting irregularities or not, they don't have the right to overturn a constitution. Now, the other thing that's weighing on Buchanan's mind, as it weighed on Pierce's mind, is attempting to keep some sort of structure, some sort of semblance of a union together. And so, in yet another piece of duct tape, Buchanan will overturn or restore Constitution. He'll overturn Walker's decision to overturn the Constitution. And so Kansas will be admitted as a slave state in the hopes of at least attempting to restore some sort of balance in the U.S. Senate and preserve the Union. We had talked last time about the gold discoveries in California in 1848 and how they had alleviated that economic crisis that we spent quite a bit of time going over that began in 1837. That crisis was the result of too little gold in the system, and as a result, you had an inflationary trend that led to the economic downturn. This is going to be exactly the opposite. So successful are the gold finds in California that you're actually going to have too much gold in the system. Now, let's walk through this real basically, in as basic terms as we can, in terms of what this relationship is. It's the very simple economic principle that the more you have of something, whatever that thing may be, the less valuable it's going to be. So as you increase the supply of gold, the value of gold will slide downwards, because currency is based on gold. As the value of gold slides downward, so too the value of currency, now being more and more scarce, is going to slide upwards. And when it slides upwards, prices, particularly for manufactured goods, are going to drop. And so you're going to have deflation. You know, they spend a lot of time in economics and in the pop culture talking about inflation and the dangers of inflation. Currently, the Federal Reserve concerns itself with inflation. They don't talk a lot about deflation. Now, just from again, an economics 101 perspective, okay, if we think of a business cycle, and it's not my intention here, and it's well beyond our scope to explain the full proportions of a business cycle, but you have basically 4 stages, 2 of which are of concern to us: growth and recession. Well, during a growth cycle, during the growth part of cycle, when the economy is expanding, that's normally associated to a period of inflation. You're going to have modest inflation as a result of that. Therefore, the opposite of inflation is deflation. And so a deflation, where prices are dropping, is generally associated with a recessionary cycle. And this is because of the unemployment danger that comes from deflation. Well, sure enough, that's the trend that's going to begin really in 1857 and carry us through all the way to the war between the states. Now, the manufacturing sector is going to be hurt hard. The prices are going to start to drop. The agricultural sector, which is to say the cotton producers in the South for the most part, they're going to remain relatively unaffected. They'll be affected in an ancillary way, consequentially, because as the prices of manufacturing goods drop, manufacturers are making less money, which makes them less able to repay the loans that they owe to banks. Okay, they'll be less capable of reaching their financial obligations, and because they can't repay the banks, bank reserves drop, and there's less lendable funds for agricultural development. Okay, so they'll be ancillary. It'll be a consequential. They'll get hit from the side. It'll be tangential. Um, to explain this deflationary trend in a little more detail and to use uh, actual economics, I've spared you as best I can the technical discussion of economics, but economics is, after all, my first love. Actually, it's my second love. My first love is political philosophy, but that's beside the point. I thought I'd bring up again what's going to happen here, and let me get up my handy dandy laser pointer. Okay, now this is a basic economic graph. Over here we have marginal cost, and this is a straightforward marginal cost curve. I've shown this before, way early in the class, when we were talking about tariffs and their effects. Marginal cost, very simply put, is the money it costs to produce a single individual unit. Okay, so it's money out per unit, the cost per unit. Price, if you think about it, is the money in per unit. That's what you sell the product for. And so if marginal cost is $1 and price is $2, then you make $1 in profit per unit. Okay? Well, as the amount of gold in the system increases and you suffer as a result a price reduction, look at the effect. The price drops from P1 down to P2. And as a result, the profit maximizing level of production is going to slide from QX alpha 1 to QX alpha 3 and drop backwards this way. Okay? Now, as a result of that, production is going to drop. This is why deflation is associated with periods of recession where there's a general reduction in the level of product, a reduction in the level of production. Okay? And as a result of the drop in the level of production, you're going to need fewer workers. The demand for labor will go down and unemployment will rise. Okay? Well, and so what we're going to see beginning in 1857, as Buchanan comes into office, we're going to see a ratcheting up of unemployment. Well, now this is a very serious problem, okay, because we've already talked about the Free Soil Party and the Know Nothing Party, okay, and we've talked about the difficulties with slavery as a labor system. And one of the difficulties that I didn't include in the main lecture on it, but we've talked about here a little bit in the preceding discussion of disintegration is, well, one of the problems is that when you have unemployment, okay, you have people unemployed, the slaves are taking up jobs. If there were no slaves, those who are on the unemployment rolls could have jobs. And that's true and that's false. That's why I didn't include it in the main lecture. I just want to revisit that point just real briefly, because you're assuming then that if you didn't have the slaves, that they wouldn't exist. They would exist. They'd be wage laborers. And so it really wouldn't affect the unemployment as well. But popular passions, being what they are, will become even more piqued over this, particularly because the unemployment is not going to hit the agricultural sector. The unemployment is going to hit the manufacturing sector in the North. Well, the North is also where all the runaway and freed slaves are going. And so you're going to have two things happening at the same time. You're going to have an increasing number as the abolitionist movement grows in the 1850s. You're going to have increasing numbers and increasing vitality of the Underground Railroad that is going to help slaves to escape to the North. That's going to increase the potential labor pool in the North. Simultaneously, beginning in the 1840s, you have a wave of immigration, most notably from Ireland, into the north. They don't. The Irish immigrants don't migrate to the south. They migrate to New York City and Boston. And so you're going to have a massive increase in the labor pool. We talk about this in U.S. history too a bit more. Okay. And so as a result, you have this massive increase in the labor pool. At the same time, you're having an economic downturn resulting from the gold discoveries and the influx of gold in California, which leads to a deflationary cycle, a reduction in prices, an increase in unemployment. So at the same time, you're having an increase in unemployment. You're also having an increase in the labor pool coming into the north. And so this is going to put them at odds with each other. And the abolitionists will blame the institution of slavery, and it's really not the institution of slavery that's causing this problem of unemployment. And in fact, this influx of immigrants from New York will, of course, be the backdrop of the very famous and very good movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and I'm trying to, maybe it'll come to me, Gangs of New York. If you haven't seen it, see it. No, what's the other guy's name? It's going to come to me. Well, at any rate, I remember Leonardo DiCaprio. I can see him there. Bill the Butcher was the person he played in the movie. All right, at any rate, I'm getting tangentially distracted here. Okay, so that's what's going to happen. You're going to have a reduction in prices, and as a result of the reduction in prices, the profit maximizing level of production is going to drop downwards. And when it drops downward, and if you want more amplification of this, stick on my YouTube site and go to my microeconomic lectures where I go over this in great detail. As a result of the reduction in production, you're going to have less need for labor and an increase in unemployment. Simple enough? In the midst of all this, as the slaveholding states' rights cotton-producing states are now seriously contemplating leaving the Union because it's not in their best interests to stay in the Union that is by this point entirely dominated by the nationalists, Chief Justice Taney will make a landmark Supreme Court decision in one of the more famous Supreme Court cases in 1857, the Dred Scott case. The ruling that the court makes is that blacks, even freed blacks, are not citizens. Okay? The Missouri Compromise itself is unconstitutional, not simply because it is an expansive trend in national government authority to intervene in state constitutions, but because within the Missouri Compromise, it denies slaveholders the idea of slaves as property. Now, that'll be changed to some degree by the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act will change that. Okay? It will reiterate the idea that I've been making that Congress has no authority to ban slavery in the territories. This is going to ultimately repeal the Missouri Compromise and threaten the Compromise of 1850. This is a massive victory for states' rights and for slave owners. Okay? It is another episode of defining slaves as property. Okay? This brings us to the very famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln, who will now stand, we've talked at great length about the Whig Party, and we mentioned briefly the Know Nothing Party. What's going to rise from an amalgamation of that is going to be the new, revitalized Republican Party. And as I've said many times, this is not the same Republican Party as was started by Jefferson back in 1800. This is a different Republican Party. This Republican Party is unabashedly and very clearly a nationalist party. They believe wholeheartedly in the supremacy of the national government. Okay, Douglas will be the Democratic candidate, and he sides with popular sovereignty and states' rights. Okay, so he's in favor of limited national government. Lincoln himself, and this is something to go over, okay, and we'll go over this again and again. Lincoln, one of the very famous things for which Lincoln is given great credit is the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees the slaves. Well, in point of fact, the slaves in the United States and slavery as an institution is not ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. in 1862. It is ended with the passage of the 13th Amendment after the war between the states. In the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln frees no one. No one is freed. After the Emancipation Proclamation, no one is freed. The reason being the phrasing in the Emancipation Proclamation. The way Lincoln phrases it is that slaves in states that are currently in rebellion against the United States are freed. That meant that Kentucky, which was a slaveholding state, and Maryland, which was a slaveholding state, and the newly created West Virginia, which was a slaveholding state, okay, all those slaves are not freed. The other slaves that are in the states that are in rebellion against the United States, like Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia, Lincoln has no authority there. They are in an independent republic. They do not recognize Lincoln's authority, and so they don't free any of their slaves. So the Emancipation Proclamation is political theater. It's done in an attempt by Lincoln, and we'll deal with this when we get to the war between the states. It's done by Lincoln as political theater to try to maintain support for the war, because by that point, the war effort in the North is going very badly. Okay? Lincoln himself, in documentation that we have, about 5 years ago, the University of Rochester came into possession. They bought 500 original manuscript documents from Abraham Lincoln. Okay, and they've been releasing them periodically, and from those and from additional things, we know Lincoln's personal position on the idea of slavery. He was opposed to slavery on moral grounds, as a moral institution, but he was very clear to point out that he did not believe that blacks should be citizens of the United States. Neither did he believe that the African slaves were the equal of Caucasians. Okay? In point of fact, Lincoln couldn't care less about slavery. It was tangential. Okay? What Lincoln wanted to do was once and for all establish the supremacy of the national government. Okay? I mean, we're now moving towards the final critical point of this. And we'll see that in just a minute. And so what Lincoln was looking for, and what the reason, I've mentioned this before, and I'll make mention of it again now, and I'm sure I'll make mention of it again later. Okay? The war between the states in the United States often degenerates to a discussion of slavery as an institution. And you'll have learned men, history professors with PhDs, talking all about slavery as an institution and the rise of the abolitionist movement, all that, right? Slavery was tangential, okay? It is tangential to the overall argument that we've watched. We've watched it develop. We've studied it with careful detail under a microscope, this debate between states' rights and the nationalists. Well, in the 1850s, the nationalists now reigned supreme for reasons that we've talked about, okay, in the last two lectures. They now reign supreme, okay? Lincoln wants to make that supremacy permanent, no longer a political football, all right? Slavery gets credited, okay, and is used by the Union, particularly not during the war. During the war, they really don't talk about it a lot. During the war, they don't talk about it a lot. We'll see what Lincoln does to govern the dialogue during the war. And slavery really isn't talked about all that much. But what slavery is going to do for Lincoln is give him the moral high ground. Rather than appearing as a tyrannical nationalist who wants to drive under and subordinate the sovereignty of the states, he's going to be seen as a champion of liberty, wanting to free the slaves. In point of fact, he didn't care about that. Okay? And so history is written by the victors. And that's why we have this dichotomy. What we're going to end up with is that Lincoln and the Union stand for freedom of the slaves and for liberty and individual liberty, and the Southern states are seen as a collection that favors servitude and human bondage and slavery. And to some degree, that's true. Okay, but really, what you have is you have Lincoln at the head of the Republican Party, a powerful nationalist wanting to once and for all drive under and subordinate the states. Okay? And it says here, one of the interesting things that it says on this slide, and I wrote the slide, so I know it's there, and it's one of the things for which Lincoln is greatly credited, that Lincoln's only concern was the preservation of the Union. We're going to see in a minute, okay, just how much Lincoln wants to preserve the Union. Buchanan, for his part, now Buchanan is currently the president. Buchanan, for his part, has played out all of his political collateral. Okay, he's alienated people on both sides of the fence in his attempt to, duct tape the Union together and keep it together. He's alienated both sides of the fence. By this point, by 1857, 1858, 1859, the end of the 1850s, the United States is completely dichotomized. Okay, it's completely polarized into states' rights versus the nationalists. Okay, which it always has been. There's always been this running debate, but at this point, it's polarized. The two sides are not going to compromise. The two sides are not going to get back together. This thing is falling apart. Okay, there's no way you can hold it together with any kind of compromise solution. Buchanan is going to try. Okay, Lincoln will not. There are alternatives to going to war. Always. Okay, Lincoln could have engaged in some sort of compromise, but he absolutely refuses. Okay. For Buchanan's part, he'll attempt a number of different ideas. He'll entertain a number of different ideas in an attempt to keep the states' rights people, which are associated with the slaveholding states, to keep them in the Union. First of which is convene a constitutional convention. Let's rework the Constitution, as I mentioned and have mentioned throughout. When Madison writes the Constitution, inherent in the U.S. Constitution, there is a conflict between states' rights and national sovereignty. They don't resolve that in the Constitution. Buchanan's proposal is, let's get together, let's have a constitutional convention, and once and for all clearly establish the distinction between national sovereignty and state sovereignty. Lincoln opposes this. No, there can be no compromise. In fact, if you look at the entire political career of Abraham Lincoln, the entire political career, you will never find one compromise. Lincoln never compromises on anything, either before he's president or during his presidency, and of course, there is no after his presidency, is there? And so, Lincoln, in political psychology, we look at the personality traits of political leaders, presidents, for example. And one of the things that is an attribute is whether they have a democratic personality or a dictatorial personality. Lincoln definitely has a dictatorial personality. When it comes to declaring war and using military force, for example, in the war between the states, he never consults Congress. Okay? That's why it's not a declared war. He just orders it under executive order, under executive privilege. He'll just order it. Okay? He'll suspend, as we'll see in the discussion of the war between the states, he suspends the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and kills the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. But at any rate, now I'm ranting against Abraham Lincoln. And I'm ranting against Lincoln because people think he's such a tremendous hero and tremendous president. In point of fact, he was a substandard president. He was a horrid military leader. He was a terrible human being. Okay? If he'd been at any other time than during the war between the states, he would have gone down as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. But instead, we have this gigantic statue of him in Washington, D.C., where all the tourists come and flock and take pictures and glorify Abraham Lincoln. At any rate, enough. I'll try to contain that as we move forward. We also have the Crittenden Plan. Okay, now the Crittenden Plan proposes extending the Missouri Compromise. All right, if the problem is that this territory in the Mexican cession is not covered in the Missouri Compromise, let's extend the Missouri Compromise. Okay, to include not only the Louisiana Purchase, but also the Oregon territories and the Mexican cession, meaning that everything below 3630 in their constitutions, they can have slavery. Now, for the reasons that I've previously mentioned regarding the American Southwest and the lack of viability of that territory for slavery as a labor system, this isn't going to restore the balance of power in the U.S. Senate. Okay, might be seen kind of as a compromise, but it really doesn't restore the power in the U.S. Senate. Furthermore, it continues this precedent that was set with the Missouri Compromise of the national government dictating what states can and cannot have in their constitutions. Okay, and that's a real issue. It's not a question of slavery. It's a question of states' rights, whether or not the national government has the authority to intervene in states' constitutions. Okay, so that one's going to be defeated. That falls on deaf ears. A more interesting plan proposed by John Tyler. And it's really to keep the upper South in the Union more than the lower South. It will, in fact, one of the things we found out from these letters, these Lincoln letters that the University of Rochester got, is we find out that this plan was actually expanded to include the lower South as well by their freedom. Okay? By the slaves. The national government, okay, will open up the public coffers and buy the slaves, buy their freedom, and then free them. Okay? Because for the slaveholders, the slaves represent a substantial investment. And I've mentioned this before. The average value of a slave, particularly an adult male slave, was about $30,000 in modern terms. Okay? You buy them. You give them, it was for $500. You buy $500 a slave. Okay? And then free them. This was expanded to the lower South. Lincoln, this was expanded actually after Lincoln had become president, after he was elected. He refused it. He said, no, all of it's opposed by Lincoln. By the time he's elected, Lincoln has one objective: to establish, by force of arms, the supremacy of the national government once and for all. And, you know, in objective terms, we can understand Lincoln's position on this. Okay? This bizarre, this dialectic, this debate has gone on now for 70 years, since 1789. It has gone on for 70 years, okay, on distinguishing state sovereignty and national sovereignty. We have watched with microcosmic detail, okay, we have watched this dialectic progress. We have seen national sovereignty expand and state sovereignty retract. We've watched this. We've seen all these secessionist movements that have risen up since the 1790s. Okay? Lincoln's decision is that once and for all, this has to stop. We can no longer have this debate. The United States will not be able to move forward as a republic so long as this dialectic polarization is pulling the country in two different directions. There has to be a resolution once and for all. Now, the Confederate States, for their part, they feel the same way. But their idea is to resolve it by dissolving the Union and establishing a separate Union in which states' rights reign supreme. Well, at any rate, Lincoln will be elected in November of 1860. When he is elected, it is now very clear to all of the states' rights advocates, to the slave-holding states, to the South, that there's no going back. The nationalists dominated the 1850s. Okay? It will culminate with the election of Abraham Lincoln, the most nationalistic of all of the presidents that we've studied to date. Okay? They now know there is no way that states' rights will anymore be entertained. And as a result, they're going to make the decision to dissolve the Union and secede. Shortly after Lincoln's election, led by South Carolina, the Confederate States of America will be formed, and South Carolina will lead the course. By February 1 of 1861, 6 other states will join the Confederacy, will join South Carolina, and they'll form the Confederacy. Now, this gives Lincoln the opportunity he's been waiting for. We now have, and this will be the only one we cover here, the remainder of it will be covered when we talk about the war between the states. We deal with Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter lies in Charleston Harbor. If you've ever been to Charleston, South Carolina, you've seen it. If you haven't been to Charleston, go. It's a beautiful city. It lies in the middle of Charleston Harbor. It is controlled by the Union. It is controlled by the North. Federal troops lie there, are stationed there. But it is in South Carolinian territory. Okay? Now, Lincoln is going to make the first of what will be many miscalculations. And we'll get to that in a minute. First, we want to look at the tactical position of Fort Sumter. Now, let's line a few things up, okay? Because we want to see exactly how Lincoln manipulates this situation, because it is actually brilliant. Give the devil his due, it's actually brilliant. Fort Sumter is surrounded on all sides by South Carolina. It is if you look at it, what it represents to South Carolina is foreign occupation of South Carolinian territory. Okay? So they resolve themselves to remove the Union troops from Fort Sumter. And at first they go and try to negotiate the evacuation of the fort. Lincoln will not have any of that. But let's line this up now. The Confederacy has virtually no fleet. The Union, over the last 60 years, has developed one of the largest fleets in the world, certainly enough to dominate the fleet of the Confederacy, and it will, throughout the war, dominate. Okay, they have absolute naval supremacy from the beginning of the war. Easily, Lincoln could have either sent in the fleet to evacuate the fort, or sent reinforcements and resupplied the fort so that it could withstand a siege. Lincoln does neither. In chess terms, he decoys Fort Sumter. He wants Fort Sumter to fall. Because South Carolina, seeing an advantage, will move militarily to press their claim to Fort Sumter. When they do so, that can be seen as an act of aggression, which will allow Lincoln, at least on moral grounds, to call out the army, which in fact he will do. He orders the garrison not to evacuate, does not resupply them. Now, Lincoln, for all of his difficulties, it should be noted, and we'll discuss this when we get into the war between the states, Lincoln never served a day in the army, so he knows very little about military affairs. This won't stop him from acting as commander-in-chief. But despite that, he's not an idiot. He knows that without support, Sumter cannot withstand the forces of South Carolina and the Confederacy. And so he decoys it. He orders them not to evacuate. Very few people are killed. I think only one person was killed and a couple of people wounded before they surrender the fort. Okay? On 10 April 1861, Sumter will be attacked. It will collapse very quickly, at which point Lincoln has his excuse for war. And he summons up the militias. He calls out the army. He will, among other things, institute the first universal conscription in U.S. history. Okay? Now, here's the first of his miscalculations. Who he orders to lead the charge into South Carolina is the militia of Virginia. Lincoln's first self-deception is that the states of the Upper South, and we talked about this during the economics of slavery, They had diversified out of slavery to a large degree. About 2/3 of their slave population had been sold off to the deeper South, okay, to the lower South. Lincoln believed that because of this, they would seek to stay in the Union. They weren't the ones that led the secessionist movement. South Carolina was. So he calculated that Virginia, okay, in the upper South principally, would stay in the Union. And so he calls upon, oddly enough, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia to march south and force South Carolina and the Confederacy back into the Union. Of course, we know how that works out for him. Robert E. Lee, instead of doing that, joins the Confederacy and becomes the primary military commander of Confederate forces, at least in the East, who will remain in command of the Army of Virginia throughout the war, which is not good for the Union, because Robert E. Lee is truly one of the great generals of history, American or not. And between he and Thomas Stonewall Jackson, they're probably the two best generals the United States ever produces, then or now. And he will, through his tactical and strategic wizardry, keep the Union at bay for 4 years, despite against overwhelming odds, which we'll talk about at great length and in detail when we go over the war between the states. And this concludes the period of disintegration.